That idea that our desires themselves are outside our control strikes at the heart of how most religions talk about free will. It's also where the contradiction quietly begins to unfold. Free will is supposed to be the escape hatch, the reason a loving God could allow suffering, why people are punished for sin, and how salvation is justified as a personal choice. It's held up as the moral backbone of religious judgment. You choose right or you choose wrong, heaven or hell, reward or punishment. It's all yours to decide. But when you look closely, really closely, that claim starts to crack, because the same religious frameworks that defend free will also lay out a world in which your path is known in advance, your nature is predetermined, and your choices are shaped by forces you never chose to begin with. Let's start with a basic question. What does it mean to choose freely? Is it just doing what you want? Then what if you only want what you were trained to want? What if your upbringing, your brain chemistry, your culture, and your fears, all outside your control, shaped what you wanted in the first place? If a child raised in a strict religious household fears hell from the age of 4 and chooses salvation out of that fear, is that freedom or is that conditioning? This isn't abstract, it plays out in real people's lives every day. A person raised in a violent, abusive environment whose brain adapts to survive by shutting down empathy may commit acts that we call evil. But when that person stands trial in a religious context, they're told they had a choice. They chose sin, even if every input in their life pointed them there. Religious doctrines often claim you're judged by what's in your heart. But if you don't get to choose what kind of heart you have, then what exactly are you being judged for? It gets more contradictory the deeper you go. Many theologies insist that God is all-knowing, not just of the present but of the future. That means before you're even born, God already knows where you'll end up, heaven or hell, saved or damned. Your story is already written, but somehow you're still held responsible for writing it. This isn't a fringe idea. In mainstream Christian doctrine, it's called divine foreknowledge. God sees all time at once. He knows what you'll do before you do it. And yet, you're still the one to blame for doing it. Think about what that implies. If your fate is known in advance, it cannot be otherwise. If it cannot be otherwise, it is not chosen. And if it's not chosen, then it's not free. Some religious thinkers have tried to solve this by splitting hairs. They'll say, God knows what you'll do, but He doesn't force you to do it. But knowing something will happen with absolute certainty means it can't not happen. If God already knows you will sin, you cannot not sin. So where exactly is the room for real choice? The idea of a test, that life is some kind of exam, depends on the assumption that everyone starts on equal footing. But clearly, they don't. A child born into a fundamentalist community will have a completely different sense of morality than one raised in a secular, science-literate home. Their emotional associations, their fears, their guilt, their vocabulary for even talking about ethics, all different, and those early frameworks are sticky. They shape the architecture of the brain. Neurologically, the concept of choice becomes something that happens inside a system that was built long before the person was old enough to question it. Even the famous biblical story of Pharaoh hardening his heart isn't about freedom. In Exodus, God actively intervenes to make Pharaoh unyielding, in other words, to take away his freedom, just so he can show his power. The story doesn't hide this. God says it himself, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. That's not free will, that's divine manipulation. But the myth has to be protected, because without it, the idea of sin doesn't hold. And without sin, what's the point of redemption? If a person couldn't have done otherwise, if they were always going to fall, then punishing them for it becomes morally empty. This is where the philosophical weight of determinism comes in. Not just scientific determinism, the idea that cause and effect governs the universe, but also psychological determinism, that our thoughts, desires, and actions are the product of prior causes, many of which we're unaware of and didn't choose. People often resist this because it feels like it takes something away from us. They say without free will, there's no responsibility. But that's not actually true. Responsibility still matters, society still functions, it just shifts the focus away from blame and toward understanding. And that's a very different framework from what you find in most religious traditions. They need people to be at fault. They need guilt. Because guilt is what makes obedience feel necessary. It's what keeps people on the path. Not because the path is rational, but because stepping off it is framed as an act of rebellion, a willful betrayal. But if the rebellion was inevitable, if it was written before you were born, then punishing someone for it is like yelling at water for being wet. Even the language used in doctrine is quietly loaded. He gave you free will makes it sound like a gift. But gifts come with conditions. In this case, the condition is that if you don't use the gift the right way, you'll suffer eternally. That's not a gift, that's coercion, and coercion by definition cancels freedom. To make it even more confusing, some branches of theology outright reject free will, like Calvinism, which teaches predestination. According to that view, God has already decided who's saved and who's damned. Nothing you do changes that. You're just living out a role. Yet, even in those systems, people are still told to obey, to repent, to choose righteousness. It's like being cast in a play where the ending is fixed, but you're still punished for your lines. This contradiction isn't just theological. It reflects something deeper about how religious systems maintain control. If people truly believed their actions were the result of factors outside their control, they might focus more on social structures or mental health or education. But if people are told everything is a matter of personal choice, it becomes easier to shame them and harder to ask why the system failed in the first place. You see this in how religious communities treat addiction, for example. In many places, it's still seen as a moral failure, a lack of willpower, even though the science is clear that addiction is driven by brain chemistry, trauma, and environmental factors. But acknowledging that means letting go of the idea that people choose sin, and if you can't blame sin, you can't sell salvation. There's also a practical reason why religious institutions cling to the idea of free will, even when their own doctrines contradict it. It preserves the illusion of fairness. Without it, divine justice becomes cruelty. If someone is born into a situation where belief is nearly impossible, surrounded by conflicting doctrines, abusive authority figures, or simply no exposure to the true religion, then what happens to them after death? If the answer is punishment, then any claim of moral justice collapses. So the fallback is always, they had a choice, as if the circumstances of birth, language, culture, and trauma were all just scenery. This gets especially awkward when you factor in how much belief is tied to geography. Most people believe in the religion dominant in the region where they grew up. Statistically, that's not a coincidence, that's environmental programming. Yet religious thinking asks us to ignore that, to treat faith as though it emerged in a vacuum, freely and fairly. And this illusion has consequences. It lets people assume superiority, not because of what they've done, but because of what they believe. The narrative becomes, I chose truth, you chose lies. But what if neither person ever really chose at all? What if they each followed the only path that made sense to them, based on the tools they were given? We don't choose what language we grow up speaking. We don't choose which books are read to us or which fears get planted in our heads at 6 years old. And yet somehow religion tells us we're accountable for what we believe in our hearts by the time we die. It's like holding a student responsible for failing a test written in a language they never had the chance to learn. There's also a strange double standard in how free will is applied. When someone follows a doctrine faithfully, that's seen as a conscious, virtuous choice. But when someone questions or rejects it, suddenly it's pride, ego, temptation. In one case, you're exercising free will. In the other, you're accused of abusing it. But either both are valid expressions of freedom, or neither is. You can't have it both ways. And while many believers take comfort in the idea of a God who watches over them, knows them, and has a plan, that plan undermines freedom too. If your life is unfolding according to divine design, then your role is already scripted. You can't truly make your own choices inside a fixed narrative. You're just playing your part. There's something deeply human in wanting our lives to have meaning, to believe that what we do matters. And ironically, rejecting free will doesn't take that away. It just changes what meaning looks like. It moves it from cosmic judgment to human experience. We can still care, we can still act, but we do it without pretending we're outside the causal chain. One of the quietest casualties of the free will myth is empathy. When you believe everyone has the power to simply choose good or evil, it becomes easy to stop asking why people act the way they do. It makes moral failure seem like laziness, or worse, evil for its own sake. But the real world is messier. People steal when they're desperate. They lash out when they're scared. They lie when they've been lied to. These aren't excuses, they're explanations. And explanations are how we actually make progress. When we abandon the myth that everyone is a perfectly autonomous moral agent, we stop blaming people for being broken and start asking how they got hurt in the first place. You can see this shift happening slowly in places like criminal justice reform. More and more researchers are showing that punitive systems don't work because they're based on the idea that people need to be punished into making better choices. But if those choices were never freely available in the first place, what are we really punishing? The same logic applies to religious systems that threaten eternal punishment. What good is eternal suffering for a finite act, especially if that act wasn't freely chosen? There's also an uncomfortable reality hidden in the way salvation is offered. In many traditions, the key to salvation is belief. But belief isn't a choice. You can't just flip a switch and make yourself believe something. Try believing, really believing, in a religion you weren't raised with. It doesn't work. Belief is shaped by experience, evidence, emotion, not by will. And someone is told, you must believe or you will suffer. They're being asked to do something they don't actually control. That's not a moral choice. That's psychological extortion. And even when people do believe, sincerely, they're often driven by fear. Fear of punishment, fear of rejection, fear of disappointing a divine figure they were taught to revere since childhood. And fear is a terrible foundation for freedom. It doesn't open doors, it narrows them. Some religious thinkers try to escape this by redefining free will. They say, it's not about doing anything you want, it's about the freedom to choose what's good. But that's not freedom, that's constraint. If the only acceptable choice is obedience, then you're not choosing, you're complying. Real freedom includes the possibility of error, but in many religious systems, error leads to eternal suffering. That's not choice, that's a trap. The uncomfortable truth is that religious doctrines often use the idea of free will not because it's philosophically coherent, but because it's emotionally useful. It shifts the burden of suffering onto the individual. It makes people responsible for their own pain, their own failure, their own damnation, and that keeps them in line. But if you reject that framing, if you accept that your decisions are shaped by biology, history, and circumstance, you don't become passive. You become curious. You ask deeper questions. You look at people not as sinners or saints, but as human beings responding to the world they were given. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of real morality, not one built on fear or reward, but one built on understanding. One of the things that rarely gets discussed in this conversation is how tightly the idea of free will is woven into religious guilt. Because guilt, in religious terms, isn't just regret. It's a burden, a moral weight, something you carry until you confess, repent, or surrender. And that weight only makes sense if you could have done otherwise. That's the condition. You must have chosen wrong and known better. But what if you didn't know better? What if you couldn't? This matters because guilt is often used as leverage. It keeps people obedient. It keeps them coming back, not because the teachings make sense, but because they feel responsible for a brokenness they never actually chose. You can see this in how some people describe their own thoughts, calling them sinful, shameful, evil, even when those thoughts come from trauma or natural curiosity or completely normal human instincts. They are told to confess not only their actions, but their inclinations, their impulses, their doubts. That's not spiritual freedom. That's surveillance of the self. And once a person internalizes that, once they believe their own mind is suspect, the idea of choosing righteousness becomes hollow. Because now they're not choosing freely, they're choosing under pressure, under the fear of eternal consequence. Let's step outside theology for a moment. In psychology, we know that people's decision-making is heavily influenced by subconscious processes, cognitive biases, developmental conditioning, even hormone levels. And yet, religious models tend to ignore this. They treat the mind as a neutral stage where good and evil perform, and your job is simply to pick the right actor. But if your perception of right and wrong is shaped by what you were taught, what you were praised for, and what you were punished for, then what exactly are you choosing? Here's an example. A child is raised in a home where questioning authority is seen as rebellion. They grow up being told that doubt is dangerous, that faith must be protected from logic. Years later, that child hesitates to read a book that challenges their beliefs, not because they evaluated it and disagreed, but because they were trained to fear the consequences. Was that a free decision? What about people who grow up with no exposure to any religion at all or to a completely different one? If they reach adulthood and don't believe in the God of a specific doctrine, are they guilty? Are they choosing to reject truth? Or were they simply shaped by the circumstances of their life? This gets particularly grim when you think about doctrines that promise eternal torment for non-believers. It's one thing to argue that people who do harm should be judged. It's another to say that someone born in the wrong country, raised in the wrong family, speaking the wrong language, deserves infinite punishment for not arriving at the correct belief before death. And yet, that's what many religious doctrines imply, that belief is not only a choice, but the most important one, with the highest possible stakes. And somehow this choice must be made in a world full of contradictory claims, with no clear evidence, under constant pressure. It's not a moral system, that's a gamble. Now, if someone finds comfort in their faith or feels personally transformed by their beliefs, that's their experience, and it's not about dismissing that. What we're talking about here is the structure, the internal logic of the doctrine itself. And when you take away the assumptions and really look at how it works, the idea of free will starts to unravel, because freedom isn't just about the ability to act. It's about having real options. And most religious systems don't offer that. They give you one path, one set of truths, and if you step outside it, you suffer. In that way, the myth of free will serves a purpose. It protects the system from criticism. If someone leaves the faith, the system isn't at fault, the person is. If someone struggles with belief, the system remains perfect, the person is weak. The logic is airtight because it's circular, and that's exactly the kind of logic that bad ideas thrive in. Even when religions claim that everyone has the same access to truth, it's clearly not true. Some people are born into privilege, into education, into safety. Others are born into fear, into war, into indoctrination, and yet all are judged by the same invisible standard. If a just God exists, would that God judge a traumatized child in the same way as a philosopher with every luxury of thought? And if the answer is no, if context matters, then we're already admitting that free will is not so simple. But instead of facing that complexity, most doctrines simplify. They reduce morality to choice and then ignore everything that shapes the chooser. Even the very concept of sin becomes suspect when you take away free will. What is sin, if not a deviation from a path you were supposedly free to follow? But if you were never free, if your mind, your instincts, your situation led you away, then sin becomes nothing more than a label, a way to say you failed, even if success was never available. And that brings us to something rarely discussed in religious circles: compassion without judgment. And yet it can alter things significantly. Because when you stop believing that everyone is free in the same way, when you see people as products of complex causes, judgment starts to feel shallow and compassion starts to feel necessary. Not because people are innocent, but because they're human. And humans are flawed, confused, reactive, afraid, just like us. That kind of morality, rooted in understanding instead of condemnation, doesn't need divine oversight. It doesn't need the threat of hell. It just needs honesty about how people work. And that's something religious doctrine has never been comfortable with, because the more honestly we look at ourselves, the more we understand why people do what they do, the harder it is to sustain the fantasy that we all have equal freedom. And without that fantasy, the moral architecture of reward and punishment starts to collapse. It's no coincidence that doctrines built on eternal judgment need free will to function. Without it, the whole structure turns brittle. And yet, almost every meaningful insight we've gained about human behavior over the past century pushes us in the opposite direction. We've learned that early childhood experiences shape the adult brain in deep, often irreversible ways. We've learned that trauma changes how people process risk, memory, and impulse. We've learned that poverty shrinks the bandwidth available for long-term thinking, that chronic stress affects decision-making, and that education level influences moral reasoning. None of this fits comfortably within a worldview where people are expected to freely choose good or evil as if they were picking items from a menu. And yet, that's how religious systems continue to frame it. There's an odd flattening of humanity in that framing. No context, no nuance, just you chose wrong, and the rest of the story doesn't matter. This kind of moral arithmetic ignores everything that makes a person who they are, and it's that erasure, that refusal to engage with complexity, that makes the doctrine of free will so damaging, because it turns suffering into personal failure and obedience into virtue, regardless of whether that obedience was coerced. The idea that God wants you to freely choose Him, but will punish you eternally if you don't, is not free choice. It's emotional blackmail dressed up as spiritual liberation. It's also deeply asymmetrical. You're told that one wrong decision, made in fear or doubt or ignorance, can lead to eternal punishment. But no finite act should logically warrant infinite consequences. That's not justice. That's metaphysical vengeance. And the only way that's maintained as fair is by clinging to the illusion that you had full control when you made the choice, that you knew the stakes, understood the options, and still walked away. But very few people, if any, live in that kind of clarity. What's more common is confusion, mixed signals, conflicting teachings. People born into one faith who later learn about another and wonder which one, if any, holds up. People who sincerely want to do the right thing, but don't have the tools to evaluate truth claims. People who spend years struggling with questions they're told they shouldn't even ask. And through all of that, the doctrine insists you are responsible. What makes this even more troubling is how often belief is linked to identity, not reason. People believe what they do because it's part of who they are, a tie to family, community, self-worth. Shifting beliefs means risking all of that, and most people don't make those changes lightly, or quickly, or without pain. So again, where's the freedom? Even religious conversion, which is often held up as the clearest example of free will, someone choosing to accept truth, is rarely about pure choice. It's almost always wrapped in emotion, crisis, loss, hope, pressure. It's a decision made in moments of vulnerability, not in a vacuum of logic. So if your salvation depends on making a certain choice, but the conditions for that choice are shaped by fear, trauma, or indoctrination, then it's not really a choice at all, it's a reaction. It's also important to remember how long this myth has been used to justify inequality. Throughout history, people in power have used the doctrine of free will to argue that the poor are lazy, that the oppressed brought it on themselves, that suffering is self-inflicted. And in religious frameworks, this becomes even more intense. Suffering as punishment for sin, poverty as divine justice, disaster as correction, because the alternative, that people suffer through no fault of their own, would undermine the entire moral foundation of religious control. And so the myth persists, but the cost is high. People internalize shame for things they couldn't help. They see their pain as punishment, their doubts as betrayal, their failures as rebellion, and all of it is presented as freely chosen. That kind of thinking doesn't just distort ethics, it damages lives. And the irony is, letting go of the myth of free will doesn't lead to moral collapse, it leads to moral clarity, because it forces us to stop blaming people and start understanding them. It shifts the focus from punishment to prevention, from condemnation to compassion. You don't need to believe people are fully free to believe they can grow. You just have to recognize that growth happens under the right conditions, and that creating those conditions is more effective than handing out punishments. And even if we can't choose what we want, we can want to understand. We can value truth, we can build systems that reduce suffering instead of moralizing it, we can replace judgment with empathy, not as a soft alternative to justice, but as a deeper version of it. So when religious doctrine insists that free will is the foundation of morality, it's worth asking, morality for whom? Morality based on whose freedom? And what happens when that freedom turns out to be an illusion? Because if we truly care about right and wrong, not just the words, but the impact, we have to go beyond stories, beyond doctrine, beyond the tidy categories of sin and virtue. We have to look at people as they really are, not blank slates, not fallen souls, but complex beings shaped by 1,000 forces they never chose. And once we do that, the idea of eternal judgment starts to feel not only unfair, but deeply disconnected from reality. It becomes a moral story imposed on a world that doesn't behave that way. But when you let go of the myth, what's left is something more honest, more humane, a morality grounded in cause and effect, in compassion, in care, not in cosmic punishment or divine surveillance. And in the end, maybe that's the kind of morality worth building, one that doesn't depend on illusions to work.